All right, so question one from our book. If you're very astute, you'll notice I'm wearing the exact same thing as we had in class on the 31st because I am recording this right after class. Life of professors, I guess. All right, so question one from Van Patten and Bonatti. Again, a pro tip. I would hope that you read the pages before I present this to you because there aren't that many pages. And I really, really, really think you need this, my opinion, to be a second pass. Okay? So please, if you haven't read it, pause and go read it, right? Any question in our book is like 3 pages. And by 3 pages, I mean 3 pages. Okay? Or maybe 4. Okay? So please pause, go read, come back. It should take you 10 minutes at the most. I hope. Maybe longer, whatever. Okay, so question one. So what is the initial state of second language, or L2, right? So initial state, we talked briefly in class today, actually, that the initial state is it is what you arrive into a second language with. This sounds like a really strange question, but it can affect a lot what we assume is happening, right? So initial state can be it can be anything from pre-existing knowledge that's relevant to it to you could define it as what kind of morphology do I have in the second language, which would be none, I would assume, right? And so if we ask, therefore, how is it different from the initial state of the first language? I mean, as far as knowing morphology in advance, probably nothing. However, if you define the initial state as coming into with or without knowledge, when you learn your first language, you are very, very young and come into it with no knowledge, really. Just what your little eyes are absorbing from the context, right? And even then, your brain can't process very much. So the initial state of L1 is nothing, basically. Or is it? But we'll get back to that. But it's certainly not world knowledge, right? And then the question, but when we learn a second language, there's definitely stuff there, right? So we can talk in a second about what is there for a first language. But a second language, definitely you already know a language or 2 or 3. So you're not coming in as a complete tabula rasa, right? You're not a blank slate. There's stuff there, but the question is, what stuff is that? Transfer. Okay, so here you see 3 questions, and we're going to talk a little more. I'm going to give you some time to kind of think about these questions in class. But these are sort of guiding questions to this particular section, right? To this question 1. What is transfer? Is transfer always good? And do we have other ways of acquiring knowledge about languages? Now, transfer, if you flip back to our glossary, it's in the T's near the very end of the book. Transfer is the knowledge you bring from one language to another. Okay. Transfer, for example, if I speak English and I acquire Spanish, let's say, I might come into Spanish knowing that there are words like the, right? Any language I walk into where that's true, that's good information in Spanish, in French. But if I learn Korean, as I have tried, knowing that the exists is pretty not useful in Korean because guess what? Korean doesn't do the in the same way. You know, it's in Korean when you talk about nouns, you mark definiteness and specificity, the stuff that the tends to mark, in other ways, right? They're usually byproducts of other particular morphology, like for example, the accusative marker that says, hey, I'm the thing taking the, basically it tells you the theta rule, right? Or a case, really, but whatever. I think it says, I'm the object, right? That marker is optional in Korean unless it's definite or specific and I think a person. So you are indirectly marking what the directly marks in English, which means knowing the isn't that useful if I go into certain languages. So transfer is me taking knowledge from my first language into my second language. Is it always good? Well, me going into Spanish, knowing the exists makes me go, well, this L in law business, this the that belongs to Spanish exists. So it's pretty good, right? It's almost exactly the same, so that's cool. Go back over to Korean. Is that helpful? No, because me as a learner, I'm going, where's my the? There's no the. Is this the? Is that the? Where's the? You know, transfer isn't always good, right? So going back to the Spanish example, it was helpful. So let's imagine I'm using transfer And I just have to look for what to stick on top of stuff. To acquire knowledge, right? I'm going, well, I need to find something that's like the. Um, one of the questions here that you see is, what other kinds of ways do we have to acquire knowledge about languages? And the answer is, well, there's two things that spring to mind. One is instruction, right? So I can teach you, for example, if you go into Korean, if I'm looking for the and my teacher says there is no the, go, oh, really? Wow. And they say there isn't, sorry. Like, okay. And so I can learn via instruction. But there's also innate knowledge. And then, so everyone has to pause for a second and go, I'm not sure what that means, unless you do, in which case, cool. But you might not and probably don't quite know what I mean when I say there's innate knowledge that can help you learn languages that isn't transfer, okay? And this gets back to what's different between L1 and L2. Presumably, L1 also has innate knowledge, okay? This is the universal grammar thing we're talking about. So even thinking about our first language, what do humans know innately about language, right? Now, there are shared knowledge, things that are true across all languages, which we call principles. And there are things that differ between languages. So languages A, B, C, and D do it one way, and E, F, G, H, and for kicks, I, do it a different way, right? And these are parameters because there's at least two ways to do it, right? Being a language that does not require a subject pronoun, for example, is a parametric difference. So if I'm talking about, English and French and German live over here in this first group where I need to have a subject pronoun. If I say a sentence and I skip my I, it sounds really weird. It would sound like if say a sentence and I don't say my I, it sounds weird in English to do it that way. That's true of other languages. Whereas over here, there are languages that don't require it. Spanish and Korean, just for kicks, are two languages where you don't need a subject pronoun. And in fact, if you use one, you need to have a reason, okay? And so this is a parametric difference, right? And you might say to me, how do I innately know that? So let's talk briefly about principles, okay? Things that we innately know about language. In 185, which some of you just took or took a little while ago or whatever, we talk about two things that fall under the kind of the heading of principles, right? And one we call by name and one we don't. The first one, the anaphor principle, we call by name, which is to say that anaphors need to be bound by a commanding nominal noun in its domain. You probably don't remember it by that definition, but that's not important, right? But basically, we had rules for understanding who herself, himself, themselves, itself were in a sentence based upon where other nouns were. Those rules are universal. All languages have that same rule. The only thing that differs is like the domain. Don't worry about the details. But anyway, the fact that we have rules that tell you how you can use herself, themself, himself, itself, whatever, the fact that those rules exist and they basically take the same form across, this is the anaphor principle. It's part of what we are as speakers of human languages. So we would say this is a shared, innate piece of knowledge. Because if it were something I had to acquire, what would tell me that someone who speaks a language, an Aboriginal language that developed independently in the middle of Australia, no contact with anything else, why they would have it? And so would, I don't know, Mayan, right? There's no contact between those people. There's no reason they would share the anaphor principle, as does every other language of the world. It's a human language thing, ergo, it's a principle. And we come to the party knowing this. It's part of what makes us human. This is part of universal grammar, things that our linguistic capacity as human beings contains. And children know it pretty much, they apply it a little bit. There's some acquisition involved with children, but children do the same acquisition process in all languages, so it really is universal. The second one here, the ordering principle of morphology, if you were paying attention or remember what happened in 185, we said that when you are creating words in morphology, you have to attach derivational morphemes before you add inflectional morphemes. That's something like saying if I wanted to say someone was a driver, and then there were multiple drivers, driver changes the word substantially. It takes it from, for example, a verb into a noun. An action to a person who does that action. It's derived. And drivers the plural, that S is inflectional. It just helps it fit better into the sentence. It doesn't really change the inherent meaning. It doesn't take it from drivers to driverization or something, right? It's just plural, right? And that inflectional morpheme has to come on after driver, after the derivational, because drives or languages don't work that way, right? So that's another universal thing. It is a shared knowledge about all languages because no human language breaks this rule. Ergo, we propose it is innate knowledge within humans. Now, as for when I talk about things being parametric, this is slightly harder to see immediately why it must be universal. But the point of this is that some things, all languages fall into 1 or 2 or 3 categories with regards to this. And we propose, assuming that there is such a thing as universal knowledge and innate knowledge, that sometimes that innate knowledge comes with options, right? It's like imagining the light board switch. And let's say for language, you have 10 switches and you have to go bloop, 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 and do up, down, 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 up, up, down, down, whatever, right? And language A has the first 6 up and the last 4 down. Language B is up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. Whatever, any possible combination, which then when you look at it as a glance, you think, well, these languages are totally different. They couldn't possibly be the same. But the options that they pick from are the same, right? Because it's not like there's a language out there that picks some random other thing that no other language ever would do, or that we can't imagine as a possible combination based upon what we know about the rest of the languages of the world. So parameters may have variation, but when that variation is repeated from among a set of choices across all the languages of the world, we propose that that's parametric, right? It's of options. So, for example, the domain of application of the anaphor principle, when we say in its domain, that domain can be this big or that big, depending on, I know this is very untechnical, but this is a potentially pre-syntax class, so this big or that big is sufficient. But the domain, it could be of differing sizes, right? There's also phonological rules. These are variants, right? You know, they're parametric in a way, but the point is they vary. And the null subject parameter, right, that thing I talked about with languages A through D requiring subject pronouns and E through I not requiring them, or in some sense saying don't have it unless you have a reason. This is a parameter, right? It's one or the other. Probably the clearest of these 3 examples. Okay, so getting back to what is the initial state, there are 3 types of answers to this question, okay? One is called full transfer, which is to say that the initial state of an L2 is in fact your L1, which for me would be English. My initial state of whatever new language, Russian, Quechua, whatever, that the initial state of any of those languages is English, essentially, right? The second option is that there's no transfer, which means that the initial state is only universals in any case, right? Now, I should say that even if you assume the initial state is L1, you can still assume universals are at play, but they're inside your L1 usually, right? Your L1 contains all that, so it's indistinguishable at some level. So you would say that there's no transfer, so when I show up to learn Russian, English isn't at play, it's just all the light switchboards and the universals, right? That's another potential answer to this question. The third one is partial transfer, which is a lot harder to explain on some level. But what it would mean is you would transfer some piece of your first language and not the entire thing. And we'll see an example in a second what that means, okay? So full transfer, first proposed by Schwartz and Sprouse as part of the full transfer, full access theory. If you go on to study second language at a higher level for any reason whatsoever, which is not most of you, but any of you, for example, this is within a universal grammar crowd, a pretty standard answer to what is the initial state, simply in some reason because it's the easiest one to assume, which doesn't necessarily mean it's the best. It's also fairly well supported too, right? So, and this is going to be a truth about theories. All theories have to be falsifiable and no theory can be 100% proven. So given that, it is one of the better supported ones according to UGers. And so it generally just kind of gets assumed as some place to start with, okay? So in this case, full transfer, as I said, means that their L1 is initial state, so my English is the initial state for anything else I learn. And so if I assume that, if my English is the initial state, then all of my properties of English have to be modified or replaced as part of the process of second language acquisition, right? So I might come into Russian and my brain's like, oh, I don't know, have a simple case system on your nouns. Don't mark case, right? Case is sort of the difference between, well, it's a way that we mark nouns to say what role they have in the sentence. It correlates to some degree with the theta roles. Anyway, it has a lot of morphology on the nouns, Russian, and I might show up from English and be like, oh, no, I will have simple endings. My nouns will have plural, and that's about it, right? But that means as I'm learning Russian, I have to go, oh, actually, I have to put an ending if I want to say that this noun is a tool. I have to put an ending if I want to say this noun is a possessive. I have to put an end, and so on and so forth. So I have to replace my English knowledge with Russian knowledge, essentially, in order to acquire it. So if we assume full transfer is the initial state, the process of L2 acquisition is a process of modifying, okay? We tend to call this parameter resetting, right? Where you take your existing setting in your first language and you change it to something else. So not very much morphology on nouns and lots of morphology on nouns, for example. Or if I'm learning Korean, I have to go from, I want to say my subject pronouns to don't say your subject pronouns, right? So this is what parameter resetting would be, okay? Some visual examples if visual stuff helps you. If you've got it, you can linger or not. But imagine I want to say there's coffee on the table, right? In Spanish, I would say something like café en la mesa, right? Literally, I is theirs, café is coffee, and la mesa on the table. Korean looks like this, which is basically kopi table 있어요, right? Coffee, kopi. Table, right? Table, table. A is on. That's that fourth little character in the middle blob. And then 있어요 is there is, right? There is bloop. Just one blob. That's one verb, actually. And then ASL, in a typical semester, I would ask the people who can sign to sign it. So sign it to yourself and ask yourself how many words are in there. And are they distinguishable as words is another question, okay? I think it's something kind of like coffee, like there, like on the table kind of stuff. Something like that, right? Okay. So I want to point out a couple things with the ones that are written here. English uses there is. That is 2 words, okay? Notice that in Korean and Spanish both, the blue piece is only 1 word. So in other languages, for example, in these 2 languages, there is 1 verb that means there is, which means that the thing that's causing the idea of there is to exist, the thing that instantiates it in your mind, is only a verb in these other languages. Whereas in English, you have to use the word there. Oh, I realize now that I'm saying this, that the word there is in my gloss. My original example is a contraction, but it obviously theirs is there is, right? But it's 1 word in these other languages. And there's other words. In French, it's 3. Il y a, right? On the flip side, if we look at the on the table piece, we have on the table, en la mesa, and table, right? In on the table and en la mesa, the preposition is first, right? It's a preposition, right? A preposition. That's what the pre in preposition means, is before. And Korean has postpositions, and we're going, that's the opposite of a preposition, a postposition. The prepositional type thing lives afterwards, right? There's a, I think they call it an article sometimes, but let's call it a morpheme. There's a morpheme at the end of the noun that tells you where things are with it. It's a postposition. That is different, right? It's parametrically different because this is not an exception in Korean. This is the standard, right? So if an English speaker like me wants to learn Spanish, for example, I have to reset my parameters. I have to learn that there is expressed with 1 verb in Spanish, right? That's change. But I can transfer over prepositions, no change. Or if I'm learning Korean, I got to learn that there is a verb in Korean, change. And I have to learn that postpositions exist rather than prepositions, change. So in a sense, the more differences there are parametrically between 2 languages, the more challenge there is in acquiring it because you've got more work to do, right? It's not to say that the language is more difficult. It's just that relatively speaking, you have more things to acquire. The list is longer in some sense. All right, so the no transfer position, the universals is the L1 position. So if there is no transfer from the first language, let's be honest, that this is a reasonable idea, but anyone who's learned a second language knows that their first language appears. So this is just sort of a thought experiment, right? So if we assume no transfer from the L1, the initial state is universals, okay? In our case, we would assume it's universal grammar. The only thing you have is this universal grammar formulation of what our brain has, which is principles and the idea of parameters. An idea that perhaps has not been proposed to you before is there are other claims of what the native language component looks like. There are other claims that I don't think are well supported, but that's a different story for a different day. One of them is computational complexity by William O'Grady, who used to be a UGer. And so for him, universals, that would be your initial state, would be like, how complex is something? Okay. And then there's processing universals. And we might presume these are there even if we do assume L1 transfer, right? A very famous one is Van Patten. Van Patten, he's everywhere. First noun principle, right, from 1986, which is a tendency when you're processing language. What is processing? Processing is when you're getting input of some kind, reading it, hearing it, seeing it in sign, whatever. And you have to assign a structure to it, right? Which is a necessary precursor to understanding, right? So I have to, hear or see or read something and give it structure. This is parsing specifically. And we have some tendencies when we do that. And one of them is that we have a tendency to assign the first noun we see to be the subject. And this happens in second languages. Actually, it happens regardless of whether this exists in our first language, right? So I could come from a language where the first noun is not typically the subject, which there are a few that's true. Even those people who do not have that assumption, when they are processing in a second language, will still process the first noun as the subject, which is a really curious thing, actually. So these things, they're independent of transfer. So if there's no transfer, they're still there, right? If there is transfer, they're still there, right? They're not mutually exclusive. So obviously, if we assume that universal grammar is our initial state, you show up with the anaphor principle, the ordering principle morphology, you have the options for the null subject principle, the null subject parameter. Here we're going to see the example. Oh, this is the first noun principle we just talked about, right? So L2 learners, regardless of their first language, have a tendency to process the first noun in the L2 as the subject. It happens even if the L1 is other strategies. One of the reasons this is here is that when I post these slides for you to study later, the things that I physically have already said need to be in here. So in a sense, it's a repetition, okay? But feel free to pause and reread if what I said wasn't clear. And you're welcome to think of some examples. The prediction is that even if you're learning ASL, you would still have this tendency, right? Now, partial transfer is our third position, and there's an array of potential ways for this to happen, but let's think about it. There are some people that would say that at the initial state, you transfer only lexical properties of your first language into your second language. And so to understand that claim, you have to be able to understand the difference between lexical from essentially, let's call it grammatical properties. So, so for example, you could claim that the idea of word categories would transfer, right? So the existence of, for example, that I have something, so if I was used to having a morphology to turn verbs into nouns that was attached to the end, right? A derivational morpheme is lexical in some sense, right? So if I was used to having suffixes be derivational, it would be a switch for them to be prefixes, So this is the kind of thing that they would assume you would transfer. It's also a question of like, once you have a bigger syntax tree, right? Closer down to the verb, a lot of those things have lexical properties, right? So the verb and the subject and that kind of stuff. And then higher up in the tree that you get, there are things that are arguably functional elements. If you've taken syntax, we're talking like TP and CP and that kind of stuff. And those things would be arguably not transferred. That's a very common way to do this. But, the idea would be things that have meaning, things that inherently have lexical meaning would be things that would transfer. And everything that has kind of a functional thing that changes word order and that sort of stuff wouldn't transfer. That's the claim, right? Similar partial transfer, things like only some processing strategies are transferred and not others. Pieneman, who we talked about in the intro, says this. And with that being said, he claims that similarity between first and second language is also a greater predictor of transfer. So again, Spanish and Korean, I'm more likely to transfer into Spanish than I am into Korean, would be the claim here. And that's because I'm processing it, my brain goes, these are more similar. You should transfer over English. Like, that's the kind of claim this is supposed to be, right? And processing strategies, again, are things like, which one do I think the subject is? Where is the verb? Do I know where to find tense on this verb? Like that kind of stuff, right? All right, so to wrap up, this is what our authors believe, given the evidence that they've presented. You don't have to agree. And in fact, in this class, I intend for you to have your own opinion. Now, it's reasonable to agree with the authors if you like, but you don't have to. But you can't just cite your own experiences either. Okay, our experiences at the level of an assessment. I don't care on the homework. At the level of an assessment, your experiences are not evidence. Okay, try to get past that point. Your experiences do not answer. I want you to look at the research that's been done, the evidence presented in the sections, and think about it. Okay. So the authors argue that generally full transfer is supported. Now, they're UGers, and I told you UGers tend to pick full transfer, right? One of the reasons that they say that this is likely to be true is that spontaneous speech from a second language learner generally suggests this, right? If I take someone who is high beginner, let's say, learner of Italian, and I push them to do things in Italian they're not prepared to do, because sometimes we're not, right? There's different things that we're prepared to at different levels, but I push them beyond, right? I try to keep them in a longer conversation or engage them in more past tense or whatever, that usually you start seeing more evidence of their first language, right? They'll start using word orders that look like their first language, or they'll try to stick in words from their first language. That'll happen too. You go, cookie, I don't know. And they'll keep talking in Italian or whatever. So if you push someone beyond what they're prepared to do, you start seeing more of their L1. And so the authors take this to be a suggestion that full transfer is supported. Language instructors tend to see evidence of, this is similar. Spontaneous speech is sort of like when you just people out of the blue and you just record them, you get a lot of that sort of stuff. But this is the same idea, except for language instructors will do it on purpose. I guess is the second bullet point's relevance, is that, we are purposely pushing people. And so as a result, we see a little more leaking and a little more L1 looking type things, okay? Principles and parameters is a framing of this problem that's useful for understanding the need to modify L1 assumptions, such as through parameter resetting. I'm completely fine with this claim, but obviously there are other ways to go about it. So that would be the importance of understanding principles and parameters, which you may need to define on a content assessment or the final. Again, you got to know your lexical terms. You got to know your terms. Your key terms are the only way you're going to be able to follow us. So please invest in your terminology. So anyway, so this is a useful framing, and not in one of those, it's useful, but like it's really useful. It makes predictions that are held up in research. Okay, all right. All right, here are the works that were cited in this particular presentation. Send me any questions if you want. A final thing I want to say is that the first question and maybe even the second question are some of the most intense questions, maybe the last one too, in this semester. Q1, then Q2, then maybe Q9 is somewhere in there. So if this seems a little bit intense, that's okay. We're starting off on an intense foot. And then when we get to things like explicit, implicit, input and output and individual differences, it's going to feel a bit more tangible because it's going to get closer to your realm of experience. This first couple questions in particular are very theoretical in nature. Okay, so if this one seems like a lot, hang in there. You can do it. Okay. All right. So send me questions as they come up, and I will see you on Monday of the week after Labor Day.